The farmer had lived alone so long that silence no longer frightened him. It merely settled around his shoulders like an old coat, heavy but familiar, stitched together by years of dawns, that broke without witnesses and nights, that passed without names being spoken aloud. And if anyone had ridden across that stretch of dry, Wild West land and seen him bent over the soil at first light, they might have mistaken him for part of the earth itself, a man shaped by dust and sun and loneliness until the lines on his face mirrored the cracked fields he worked. Because this was a man who had buried his parents with his own hands, who had watched neighbors sell their land and disappear westward or die in gunfights that left no songs behind. A man who had once believed he would build a family on that land and instead built only fences and furrows. Year after year until the world beyond his farm faded into rumor and memory, and people in the nearby town came to speak of him not by name but as that farmer who lives alone, as though solitude had become his identity, rather than a condition forced upon him by time and loss. He rose each morning before the sun because sleep offered him no comfort, only dreams that reopened doors he had sealed long ago, and so he worked until his muscles ached in ways that reminded him he was still alive, still capable of pain, still anchored to this world by the simple act of coaxing crops from reluctant soil, and if he spoke at all, it was to his horse or to the land itself, murmuring apologies when the harvest failed and quiet thanks when the earth was kind, because there were no people left to hear him, and truth be told, he no longer trusted his voice to behave properly around other humans, fearing it might betray the grief he had spent decades teaching himself to swallow. The Wild West was changing. Railroads cutting scars through the plains, towns swelling with strangers who carried money instead of manners, and yet his farm remained stubbornly the same, a pocket of the past where time moved at the pace of seasons rather than clocks, and he told himself that this was enough, that a man could live a full life without companionship, if he had land to tend and the discipline to accept his fate without complaint. But deep inside him, beneath the calluses and the silence, something restless stirred, a quiet hunger he pretended not to feel, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that survival was not the same as living. It was on a day like any other, a day that began with dust on the wind and ended with the sun sinking red and swollen behind the hills, that he rode into town for supplies, not knowing that this errand, this small break in routine, would fracture the careful balance of his solitude and set him on a path he could never have imagined, a path that would force him to confront the part of himself he had buried alongside his dead dreams. The town had grown rougher since his last visit, voices louder, eyes harder, and as he tethered his horse and walked toward the trading post, he sensed an unease in the air, the kind that preceded trouble. But he told himself it was none of his concern, because a man who lived alone learned early that minding his own business was a form of survival. And yet fate, it seemed, had grown tired of his careful distance from the world. Near the edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the law's reach weakened, a small crowd had gathered, men talking low, women turning their faces away, and at the center of it all stood a sight that made the farmer's step slow and his breath catch. Without his permission, because there, bound not by ropes but by the weight of human cruelty, stood a woman whose posture carried centuries of pride, even as the present moment tried to grind it out of her, her dark hair falling like a curtain over shoulders that had known hardship far beyond anything this farmer could imagine. And though her clothes were worn and her wrists bore the marks of restraint, her eyes burned with a defiance that cut through the noise like a blade. Someone muttered the words, "Last, Apache," as though she were a relic rather than a living soul, as though history had reached out and dragged her here to be bartered and pitied. And the farmer felt something twist in his chest, a sensation so unfamiliar he almost mistook it for anger, because he had heard stories, had seen what happened to people like her when the world decided they were inconvenient, and yet seeing it with his own eyes stripped those stories of their distance and replaced them with a raw immediacy that left him unsteady. The man presiding over the exchange spoke of ownership and cost, of how no one wanted the trouble she represented, of how she was better off sold than left to starve, and the crowd listened, with the uneasy silence of people who knew something was wrong but lacked the courage to name it. And the farmer, who had avoided trouble for years by keeping his head down, found himself unable to look away, because in her eyes he saw not weakness but endurance, not defeat but a challenge. as though she were daring the world to finish what it had started, and for reasons he could not yet explain. He knew that if he walked away now, the silence that awaited him back on his farm would no longer be bearable. He told himself he was acting out of practicality, that a woman who could work might be useful on a farm that demanded more from him each year, that he was too old to pretend strength was endless. But even as these thoughts formed, he knew they were lies meant to soothe a conscience he had long neglected, because the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He did not want to be the kind of man who watched and did nothing, not anymore. When he stepped forward, the crowd shifted, surprised that the quiet farmer had found a voice, and as he named his price and met the eyes of the men who would have preferred he stay invisible, he felt the weight of the decision settle into him, heavy and irreversible, because whatever came next would follow him back to his land and into the long nights he spent alone. And as the exchange was completed and the woman stood, free of the immediate threat yet far from safe, she looked at him not with gratitude but with caution, a reminder that trust was not something one could buy or assume. And in that moment, the farmer understood that the years ahead would demand more of him than crops and endurance. They would demand courage, humility, and a willingness to listen, qualities solitude had not taught him. And as they rode away from the town, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the road, he felt the land around him shift, as though the earth itself recognized that something old had ended and something uncertain had begun. And if this story has already gripped you, if you feel the weight of this turning point, stay with it, because what follows will test both of them in ways neither could foresee. And journeys like this are why stories are told. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every chapter ahead digs deeper into the heart of the Wild West and the lives it changed forever.